That there is that within each and every one of us that unites us, that makes us all the same. There is one manifesting as the many. And that allows us to move into this idea that says this is Easter, and in Christendom, this is about Jesus. And in Science of Mind, we don't look at Jesus as the great exception. We look at Jesus as the great example. Because he is the one that has risen above conditions, risen above Easter, risen above conditions to allow that amazing spiritual essence that he is to come forth. And when you do that, things happen, lives change. And it occurs to me that, Jesus didn't have to do that. He didn't have that much going on for him. He really didn't. He was a kind of poor carpenter living in a small town. He didn't just, have a mega church that he could go and speak at and be broadcast all over the world. He had some friends, some students, some disciples, but I'm sure there were points of view with his life that would not have had him turn out to who he became. And that's really the big question for us, is given the circumstances that we have, the tools that we have, our history, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to allow ourselves to rise above the circumstances and the conditions and the experiences and be who we were meant to be? Or are we going to give up and play a small game? So as we celebrate this idea of that Christ consciousness being born in each and every one of us, it is the one power. It is the God essence of us all. It is the genius within us all. And when those beings on the planet choose to let that come forth, amazing things happen. So even though the outer circumstances of Jesus' life may not have been much, he didn't go over 200 miles away from his home. He was betrayed by his friends. He was put to death. He had a mockery of a trial. Even though those things happened, he didn't let that stop him from being who he was meant to be. And that, for me, is the big question in my life, is am I going to take the trials and tribulations of things and let them stop me, or am I going to rise up into being the amazing being that I am meant to be? And I ask you that question this day. That was such a beautiful sharing, Ron, about being in Vietnam and being very disillusioned, and then you hear that Martin Luther King was shot. And you had a choice at that moment to be bitter, to take it in and just say this is all just garbage, or you took a vow for peace. You rose up into the greater you yet to be than that young man in the jungles of Vietnam. Martin Luther King did the same thing. He didn't have a bed of roses saying, change the course of history for this country. Let's march for peace. Let's go on the road to Selma. Let's have a change of consciousness in here. He didn't. He didn't have a lot of support for that, and then he got shot. And yet his very life and the way that he chose to rise above the conditions of his life changed this country. Kind of reminds me of the beginning of the Season for Nonviolence of Gandhi. And Gandhi was living in England. He was an educated man. He was an attorney. He had a wife and children and money and means, and chose to go to South Africa. And so he ordered his first class ticket through the post and went to South Africa and got on his train, only to be told that because of the color of his skin, he was not allowed to ride in the first class section. He had to go to the back of the train, or for those where there was no room on the back of the train, climb up on the top of the train and hang on. He said, no, I have a first class ticket. And so they physically took him off the train and threw him. And so then he was still trying to get where he was going, so he took a stagecoach, and they said he had to get up to let a European woman have his seat. And when he refused, they beat him. They beat him. And this is what he was looking at. Now, he could have given up and said, no, 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 I'm going to go back to England where I'm looked at with respect, where I have my law practice, and I can raise my children, except something in him rose up and said, no, that's not right. Not right for me and not right for everyone else here. And he was willing to go to prison 4 times. His prison time wasn't pretty. And he was willing to say, yes, let's fight for freedom, but let's not fight. What? Let's just stand there and let them hit us and hold ourselves to a higher standard. And he managed to get thousands and thousands of people to walk up to the British soldiers and stand there and let them club them. And in the end, he brought that country to freedom. So I look at my life and say, well, what things have held you back, Barbara? And what have you given up on? And what have you sacrificed who you know you're supposed to be because of? You know, there's not that much. The child that I was had no business growing up to be the woman that I am today. And it is all because I chose to rise up, to have a different thought, to take a different action, to do something out of the box, to do something that they said I wasn't supposed to do. And I encourage you on this Easter morning to look inside of yourself and to see what is it that is saying to you to rise up, to go beyond, to stay the course, to take a vow of prosperity, of peace, of love, of joy, even in the midst of war and mayhem and disillusionment, to rise up beyond who you think you can be. And then watch how your life changes. And I guarantee you, if you do that, love will lead the way. Love will lead the way. There's a story that has been very full in my heart for the last couple of weeks. And it's about someone who rose up and decided to live a different life than anything that had been known before. And his name is Edgar Rodas. He's a man that was born in Ecuador in a little city called Cuenca. And he became a doctor, and the tools and techniques of medical care back in the early 60s were not that great. Just not that great. So yes, he was a doctor, but he still couldn't do that much for his people. Until a ship showed up off the coast of Ecuador, and maybe you'll remember this, called the SS Hope. It was a naval vessel that had been turned into a hospital. And all of a sudden, this young man from a little village in Ecuador had his eyes open. Oh my gosh, a naval vessel, that's a pretty big boat. And it was a hospital, and it went around to different countries, and it offered top-of-the-line medical care for the people who were in need. And the young Dr. Rodas went on that ship and started exploring and learning and practicing and getting to know the people who brought the hope to Ecuador. And he made friends with one of the doctors there, one of the big high-up people, and that person took such a liking to young Dr. Rodas that he said, you need to go to the United States and you need to study there and see what medical care really can be. And so this man made arrangements because you were not well paid in Ecuador in the early 60s being a doctor. So he made arrangements for him to go to the United States, and he ended up in Miami, Florida at, was it Mercy Hospital? Mount Sinai, thank you, Margaret, at Mount Sinai Hospital. And he ended up at Mount Sinai Hospital. He was already a doctor, but he was practicing and he was learning about all of these new techniques. And there was another woman there was a woman there who was in nursing school at that same Mount Sinai Hospital. Isn't it interesting how people can come from different parts of the planet if their paths are meant to intersect? And that woman, next slide, is my cousin Dolores. And my cousin Dolores met this young Dr. Rodas at Mount Sinai Hospital and fell in love, and they got married. I was a young girl at the time, and I was the flower girl at the wedding. I was the flower girl at the wedding, and they were married for 48 years. After they got married, they moved back to Ecuador, and Cousin Ed, I can call him now, Cousin Ed was off to see the daughter of a friend of his because she was pregnant and she was having a lot of pain, and he was pretty sure she was having an appendicitis attack. And he was off to see what he could do to help. He took all of his surgical equipment with him and got on his horse and was riding into the jungles to be there for this woman. It took him 6 hours to get there, and by the time he got there, she had passed. He tried to see if he could save the baby, but the baby was gone also. And it was in that moment that he made a vow. He made a vow to find a different way to be of help to his people. He said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so he didn't know what to do right away, but he was practicing his surgical and doctor skills. He was making inquiries into the United States. He joined the American Society of Surgeons, and through that met someone at Stanford University. And he said, you know, the roads in Ecuador are so tiny that you can't get a big vehicle into those villages. That's why he's riding on horseback. He said, but maybe, just maybe, we could get a truck. So this truck was donated over 20 years ago by Stanford University to my cousin Ed. It was equipped by General Motors to become a mobile hospital unit. And this man gathered a team of the best nurses, anesthesiologists, surgeons, and he drove into the jungles to do simple surgeries that were taking away the quality of life for people, or in fact having them transition way earlier than they needed to. Next slide. This is the gurney, the bed on a lift going up from the ground into the operating room. Next slide. And that's the operating room inside of the truck. Next slide. And there are people doing an operation in that little truck. And then next slide, and we'll hold it there. No, back up. There. Okay, I guess that's it. Now this guy did surgeries for no money. No money. People didn't have money. They didn't have money to pay doctors. And he went around the world and asked people to support this, set up a foundation. And over 20 years, they did 7,500 surgeries. They would go into places where no one trusted anybody that was an official, where the government had so taken advantage of the local people that they didn't trust anybody from the outside. And they would go in there and they would do surgeries, and the people were so grateful. And then they would teach them about nutrition. They would teach them about prenatal care. They would teach them about taking care of their children. They would teach them about cleanliness, so that they would start to create an infrastructure of health and wholeness. This was an amazing man. And my cousin Ed passed a couple of weeks ago. At his memorial service in Cuenca, there were 2,000 people. And my cousin Dolores stood for 6 hours while she greeted the people after the service. There are still memorial services going on all over the world at universities that he taught at, at places that he supported. There are traveling hospitals in countries all over the world because he had the idea. He said, I will not just throw up my hands and say people will die because all I have is a horse. I will find a better way and we will have a better life. This is an amazingly famous man with awards and connections and love from thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. He started a medical school in Cuenca and required his students to come with him out into the jungle. And they fell in love with it. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to go into the jungle and they wanted to treat cleft palates and burns that had healed and people couldn't walk anymore because of that. Things that were simple surgeries. He's just a regular guy, a regular young man who grew up in a pretty small town in Ecuador and said, there's something greater in me than the conditions that I see. I've always loved him. I've always felt special around him. Do you want to meet him? Let's play the video. All the lights off, David. Thank you. Stage lights.
We decided to take surgery to the underserved parts of the country by means of an operating room built on a truck. That's a very humane way to deliver surgery, I think. People in their own environment, they don't have to be separated from the family, from the home.
Almost 5 million Ecuadorians live in impoverished rural areas with little or no access to basic health services. Dr. Edgar Rodas tackles this problem by bringing the hospital to the people. Since 1994, his Sinterandes Foundation has been providing surgical care for hard-to-reach communities spread across Ecuador. Oscar Fuerte is a fish trader. Suffering from a condition that requires surgery, he cannot work to support his family.
¿De dónde vamos a sacar un dinero para una operación?
¿Y qué tipo de operación es?
Hernia umbilical, tengo hernia umbilical. Esta hernia no me deja trabajar.
When we go to towns that are far away, very poor, we don't charge absolutely anything. The idea is that nobody can not have an operation because they don't have money.
After 6 months of living with a disabling hernia, Oscar is ready for his operation.
Oscar Fuerte is a leader in the community and had lots of friends. All the community was concerned about him.
No, lo mismo. Sácate de aquí. Dígame.
Oscar, con el doctor Rodas habla, ¿cómo está? No ha tenido ningún problema. Vaya, me alegro mucho, me alegro mucho.
Sino que de todas maneras la alimentación para los calcios, los huesos. Hay que estar aquí de mala su mesa el pescado. La salud no es tan importante. Si yo soy el jefe de la casa, si yo no estoy vivo, ¿quién me va a mantener en mi hogar? Nadie más.
For the general public, health is just the absence of disease. To me, health is related with every human activity. We have an Andean definition of health. Salud es la convivencia armónica del ser humano consigo mismo, con el medio ambiente y con los demás.
If you didn't get that statement, it was health is the harmonic coexistence of the human being with themselves, each other, and their environment. That's the native Ecuadorian concept of health. And so I look at this and say, you know, this is 1 degree of separation. This is first cousin. If Jesus hadn't risen up, we wouldn't have Easter. We would be stuck with Good Friday. So what is it that's calling us to rise up? What is it that called this young doctor to rise up and to change a country and to change a world? So I encourage you this day, no matter whether or not you know how you're going to do it or what it's going to take, love will lead you. Love will guide you. Love will open the doors to take you where you need to be. And whether you're changing a country, a world, a community, a family, or yourself, love leads the way. Happy Easter.